The rehearsal room smelled of resin and sweat, and the particular exhaustion of a production 3 weeks from collapse. Penelope Barry stood at the edge of the marked floor, watching 2 dancers run the same 8 counts for the 11th time, and did not raise her voice. She never did. She had learned a long time ago that panic was contagious, and so was calm, and only one of those was useful. Again, she said, but this time, Jinho, stop performing the loneliness. Just be lonely. There's a difference. The dancer, 26, technically flawless, terrified of being anything less than technically flawless, nodded and reset. The pianist in the corner, a patient woman named Mrs. Yoon, who had outlasted 3 previous directors, waited for Penelope's nod before starting again. This time, something shifted. The dancer's shoulders dropped half an inch. His partner, Ariam, adjusted to meet him there, and for 8 counts, the room went very quiet in the way rooms do when something true happens in them. There, Penelope said softly. That's the one we keep. She'd flown into Seoul 11 days ago on 48 hours' notice, after the production's original creative director had resigned via a 2-line email that mentioned creative differences and nothing else. The producers had been frantic, the cast had been rudderless. The sponsor, some enormous conglomerate whose name she'd been given and promptly forgotten because company names had never interested her, had apparently been on the verge of pulling funding entirely. 11 days later, the piece had a spine again. It wasn't finished, but it was alive. Penelope was 32, British, and had spent the last decade building a reputation for walking into disasters and leaving behind something people wept at. She did not consider herself remarkable. She considered herself attentive, which she'd found solved most problems other people tried to fix with money or shouting. She was aware, in the way one is aware of weather, that people in this industry were often intimidated by her. She found this baffling and occasionally very funny. "Break," she called out. 10 minutes. Someone please bring Ariam water before she collapses and I have to recast the entire second act. Laughter rippled through the room. Real laughter, the kind that only happens once trust has been earned. And the dancers scattered toward their bags and phones and each other. Penelope didn't scatter. She stayed on the floor, running the sequence in her head, marking the shape of it with 2 fingers against her palm, the way she always did when she was thinking. It was a habit her mother called conducting invisible orchestras, and her ex-fiancé had called, less kindly, checking out. She'd stopped minding what either of them thought of it years ago. She didn't notice him at first. That, later, would strike Jinho Choi as the most unsettling part of the entire evening. Not that she was extraordinary, but that she had no idea anyone was watching her be extraordinary. He was used to being noticed the second he entered a room. Rooms rearranged themselves around him without his asking. This one didn't. He stood at the very back, near the double doors, the way he always did when he came to collect his sister, a habit that had started as an obligation and had long since become something closer to routine comfort, one of the few unstructured hours in his week. He wore a dark grey suit with no tie, having come straight from a board meeting that had run 40 minutes long and given him a headache he could still feel behind his left eye. He hadn't planned to watch rehearsal. He'd planned to check his phone by the door until Sumin noticed him and finished at her own pace, unhurried, the way she'd done for the 3 years since she joined the company. That was the arrangement. It had worked well enough, but the door had opened at the wrong moment, and instead of the usual scattered warm-up chaos, he'd walked into 8 counts of silence with a woman standing in the middle of it, marking invisible choreography with 2 fingers, completely unaware that a man who ran a company with 40,000 employees had just forgotten for a full 10 seconds how to move. He didn't know who she was. He knew instantly and with an inconvenient clarity that he wanted to. She wasn't performing anything for anyone. That was what caught him. He had spent his entire adult life around people who performed, Competence, humility, gratitude, whatever the room required of them in that particular hour. He had become extremely good at recognising the seams. She had none. She stood there thinking, unwatched, and it was the most watchable thing he'd seen in longer than he cared to calculate. "You're staring," said a voice at his elbow, amused. He didn't jump. Choi Jinho did not jump. But he did turn his head slightly faster than he intended, and found his sister looking up at him with the particular expression of a woman who had just noticed something she intended to enjoy at length, later, in detail. "I'm waiting for you," he said. "You're staring?" So-min repeated, glancing toward Penelope and back at him, one eyebrow raised. "At Penelope? Is that her name?" "You don't know her name, and you've been standing here long enough that I clocked it from across the room." She crossed her arms, unhurried. "That's new. What's the occasion?" "There's no occasion. I had a meeting end early." "Did you?" So-min's tone made clear exactly how much weight she was giving that sentence, which was none. At 26, she'd spent enough years in this company, and enough years being his sister, to recognise when he was constructing an alibi in real time. He said nothing. Across the room, Penelope had stopped marking her invisible sequence and was now crouched beside one of the younger dancers, adjusting the angle of her wrist with 2 fingers and murmuring something that made the girl laugh. Whatever she was doing, she did it like it cost her nothing and mattered enormously, which he understood, dimly, was a very rare combination. "She's good," So-min said, watching him watch her. "Genuinely. Best director we've had in years. Jiho actually listens to her, and Jiho doesn't listen to anyone. I can see that she's talented. That's not what your face is doing, but sure, we'll call it that." She slung her bag over her shoulder. "Come on, I'm hungry and you're buying, since you interrupted my cool down to stand by the door like you're waiting for a table." "I know how to hold a conversation, So-min." "I didn't say you didn't. I said your face was doing something else entirely." They were nearly at the door when it happened. A small thing. The kind of moment that means nothing until much later it means something. Penelope looked up. Not because she'd heard them. The room was too full of noise for that. She looked up the way people sometimes do when they've been watched long enough that the watching itself becomes a kind of sound. Her eyes found his across the room. She didn't smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile, a flicker of amusement, a private acknowledgement, as if she'd caught him at something and found it more interesting than annoying. Then she turned back to her dancer, unbothered, and said something that made the girl laugh again. Jinho realised he had stopped walking. "Oppa!" So-min's voice quieter now, more curious than teasing. "You good?" "I'm fine." "You've been standing in that exact spot for 10 seconds. She studied him with new interest, the mischief in her expression settling into something more thoughtful. "I don't think I've seen you look at anyone like that. Ever." He didn't answer. He was still thinking about the 2 fingers moving against her palm, the 8 counts of silence, the way she had looked at him like he was a mildly interesting weather pattern, rather than the reason half the room straightened their spines when he walked in. He held the door for his sister without a word. And they were halfway down the corridor, past the vending machines and the framed production posters, going back a decade, before he spoke again. "So-min!" "Hmm?" "Who is she?" His sister didn't answer right away. When he glanced over, she was watching him with an expression that had gone unexpectedly a little soft around the edges, like someone who'd just watched her brother, who did not do this, do exactly this. "Her name's Penelope Barry," she said finally, "and I think you already know this is going to be a problem." Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, I'd love your support. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows me to keep creating immersive romance audiobooks for you. Thank you for being here. Now let's get back to the story. By the end of the second week, Soo-min had started keeping a mental tally. She didn't write it down. She was 26, not 14, and had some self-respect. But she noticed the way you notice a pattern in someone you've known your whole life. Her brother, who was chronically, almost pathologically punctual to everything except social obligations, had started arriving at rehearsal early. Monday, 40 minutes early, claiming a meeting had run short. She'd checked his calendar out of habit, old habit from when she used to manage his schedule during a gap year, and found nothing after 3 o'clock. Tuesday, he'd brought coffee, not just for himself, for whoever wanted one, which had somehow coincidentally included an oat milk flat white that ended up in Penelope's hand within about 90 seconds of his arrival. Wednesday, he'd stood by the door for 11 minutes without once looking at his phone. She knew because she'd watched him do it, arms crossed, completely still, in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the way he watched board presentations he found genuinely interesting, which was almost never. Thursday, he'd asked her, with studied casualness, how the British director was settling into Seoul. He knew Penelope's name. She'd heard him use it correctly, twice, in conversation with the producers. She mentioned all of this to Penelope on Friday during the 10-minute break, with the quiet satisfaction of someone laying out evidence she found entirely too enjoyable to keep to herself. Penelope listened, arms folded, an eyebrow climbing steadily higher. "You've been tracking his schedule." "I've been noticing his schedule. There's a difference." Soo-min took a sip of her own coffee. "I've known my brother for 26 years. He does not do unscheduled things. He does not linger. Last month he left our mother's birthday dinner 19 minutes after arriving because he had a call. There was no call. Perhaps he's simply becoming more spontaneous." "Perhaps," Soo-min said, in the tone of someone humouring a theory she found charming but entirely wrong. "You should stop being so interesting to him." Penelope didn't say anything to that, mostly because she didn't entirely trust what she'd say. She had noticed him, of course. It would have taken a genuinely committed effort not to notice a man who stood in doorways with the quiet, contained stillness of someone used to being watched but not used to watching, and who had, on Tuesday, produced an oat milk flat white without being asked, set it down near her water bottle without comment, and left before she could do more than blink at it. She'd assumed it was efficiency. Men who ran companies like his probably had assistants who researched things like coffee preferences as a matter of course. She told herself this several times, with the specific firmness of someone building an argument she wasn't fully convinced by. It was, she noted with private amusement, remarkably similar to the argument he seemed to be building for himself. He told himself he was checking on the sponsorship. This was technically true. His company's name was on the production. It was reasonable, expected even, for the principal sponsor to take an interest in his investment. Board members did it all the time. Nobody would question it. Nobody except his assistant, who on Thursday looked up from her tablet and said, with the carefully neutral face of someone who valued her job, "Should I block recurring time for the rehearsal visits, sir, for the calendar?" "They're not recurring." "Of course. I'll continue entering them individually then, at approximately the same time each day." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back with an expression of perfect professional composure that convinced no one. "That will be all, Miss Park." "Yes, sir." He went to rehearsal that evening anyway, because not going would have felt like admitting something, and admitting things was not a habit he practised. He told himself, walking in, that he would simply observe the general progress of the piece, assess whether the investment was performing as expected, and leave. He managed this for exactly 4 minutes before Penelope crossed the floor to confer with the stage manager about a lighting cue, laughing at something the man said, and Jinho found that the phone he'd been holding specifically to look occupied had gone entirely unread in his hand for the better part of 10 minutes. "You brought her coffee," Soo-min said, appearing beside him without announcing herself, the way she'd always been able to since they were children. "I brought coffee for the room." "You brought her specific order Oat milk, extra shot, no syrup. I never told you that. She watched him carefully now, some of the teasing gone out of her voice, replaced by something more like genuine curiosity. You asked someone. That's not incidental opera. That's attention. It was a reasonable question to ask a barista. Sure. She didn't push further, which surprised him more than if she had. Instead, she studied him for a moment, quiet, before saying, I haven't seen you like this in a long time. I'm not going to make a joke about it. There's nothing to make a joke about. I didn't say there was. She softened. I just think you should know you're not as unreadable as you think you are. Not to me, anyway. She left him with that, walking back toward the group with her coffee, and Jinho stood by the door a moment longer than necessary, turning her words over with the same quiet unease he brought to problems he hadn't yet decided how to solve. Later, near the end of rehearsal, Penelope found herself glancing towards the doors more than the schedule required. He was there again, half-shadowed near the entrance, doing a passable impression of a man reading something urgent on his phone. She recognised the impression for what it was. She'd spent a career reading rooms, reading bodies, understanding what people's shoulders said when their faces didn't. And there was something quietly disarming about a man that composed choosing again and again to make himself slightly ridiculous rather than simply not come at all. It didn't mean anything, she told herself, closing her notebook. But walking back to the guest house that night, through streets still warm from the day's heat, she found her mind returning to it anyway. Not the coffee itself, but the trouble he'd apparently gone to for something so small, so easily explained away as nothing. It was a small thing, it shouldn't have mattered. She thought about it the entire walk home anyway. 3 weeks in, the piece had teeth. Penelope could feel it in the room before she could articulate it, the specific hum of a company that had stopped merely executing choreography and started inhabiting it. The second act, once the production's weakest link, had become its spine. She'd rebuilt the central pas de deux from scratch, stripping away the original's ornamental lifts in favour of something sparer and more dangerous. 2 dancers who spent most of the sequence almost touching and never quite arriving. Trust is the whole piece, she told Ariam and Jinho during notes. Not the lift. The lift is easy. The trust is the part the audience actually feels. They were 3 run-throughs into a difficult new sequence. A suspended fall. Ariam tipping backward off balance with nothing beneath her but Jinho's timing, when the timing failed. It happened fast, the way accidents do. A half-second miscalculation, Jinho's foot catching wrong on the mark, his hands reaching a beat too late. Ariam's weight went past the point where his arms could recover it, and for one suspended, silent moment the entire room understood simultaneously that she was going to hit the floor. Penelope was already moving. She didn't think about it. There wasn't time to think, only to close the 8 feet between herself and the falling dancer, with a speed she hadn't accessed since her own performing days, throwing an arm out to catch what she could. It wasn't enough. Ariam's weight took them both off balance, and Penelope felt her own footing go, felt the floor tilt up toward her with the particular clarity of a moment the body understands is happening in real time. She didn't fall. An arm caught her from behind, solid, sudden, entirely unexpected. An arm that hooked around her waist and stopped her descent with a force that knocked the breath out of her, followed a half-second later by Ariam, being steadied by the same motion. Somehow both women caught in the same instant by someone who had covered the distance from the doorway faster than should have been possible. The room went very quiet. Penelope became aware in pieces of several things at once. That she was still upright, that her heart was going at a genuinely unreasonable speed, that Ariam was already being helped to sit down by 2 of the other dancers, apologising rapidly in Korean, mortified and unhurt, and that she was standing very close to Jinho Choi, whose arm was still around her waist, whose breathing was not entirely steady, and who was looking down at her with an expression that had none of its usual composure left in it at all. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She became aware that her hands had found the front of his jacket at some point during the fall, gripping the fabric without her permission, She didn't let go immediately. Yes, I think so. Neither of them moved. It should have been a 2-second moment, the kind of thing that happens, gets acknowledged, gets released. Instead, it stretched unaccountably into something longer, both of them apparently having forgotten the mechanics of stepping backward. His arm was still at her waist. Her hands were still at his chest. His heart, she realised with a kind of dazed clarity, was going as fast as hers, which she could feel through her palms, which was an entirely inappropriate amount of information to be receiving in a professional rehearsal space in front of an entire dance company. "Your hands," he said quietly, "are still on my jacket." "Your arm," she said, "is still on my waist." "Yes," he didn't move it. "I noticed." Something passed between them that had no adequate name. Not quite humour, not quite the aftershock of adrenaline. Something adjacent to both and considerably more dangerous than either. She was abruptly, uncomfortably aware of how close his face was to hers, close enough to see that his eyes weren't simply dark, as she'd assumed from across a rehearsal room, but held some warmer colour underneath, close enough to notice the very slight unevenness of his breathing, which he was clearly working and failing to bring back under control. Penelope. Her name in his voice sounded different than she'd expected. Lower, more careful, like something he was setting down rather than saying. "You should sit down." "I'm fine." "You're not shaking because you're fine." She hadn't realised she was shaking. She looked down, an excuse mostly to look anywhere other than his face, and found that her hands, still loosely fisted in his jacket, were indeed trembling slightly, whether from the fall or from something considerably less explicable she genuinely could not have said. "Adrenaline," she said. "Hmm?" He didn't sound convinced. He didn't sound entirely steady himself. But he stepped back at last, releasing her waist with what looked, to her overtired eyes, like genuine reluctance, and the space between them refilled with air and rehearsal room noise and the ordinary business of 40 people remembering they had somewhere to be. Ariam was fine, shaken, embarrassed, insisting loudly that it was her own fault, her spacing, nothing to do with anyone else. The room reorganised itself around the incident with the practised efficiency of professionals who had all, at some point, nearly broken something on this floor. Someone brought water. Someone else called for an early break. Within 4 minutes, the entire event had been folded into the ordinary texture of the day. Penelope and Jinho remained for one more moment exactly where they'd been standing, several feet apart now, both apparently searching for something appropriately mundane to say, and finding the well temporarily dry. "That was fast," she said finally. "What you did. I didn't see you cross the room." "I was already moving before it happened." He said this like a confession, like it cost him something to admit. "I don't know why. I saw her lose her footing and I was already—" He stopped, seemingly hearing himself, and looked briefly, uncharacteristically unsettled by his own sentence. "Instinct," she offered. "Perhaps." He didn't sound as though he believed that either. She became aware, belatedly, that half the room was watching them with an interest that had nothing to do with Ariam's near fall, Su-min chief among them, standing very still near the piano with an expression she was visibly trying and failing to arrange into something neutral. "Thank you," Penelope said, mostly to give the moment somewhere to go. "For catching me. Both of us, actually. That was rather impressive, technically speaking." "I wasn't thinking about technique." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine you were." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but its nearest neighbour, the kind of almost expression she'd noticed he allowed himself only rarely, as though smiling fully were a currency he preferred to spend carefully. "I should let you get back to rehearsal," he said. "You should." She didn't move. Neither did he, for one more beat longer than the sentence required. "Jinho." It was the first time she'd used his name without the surname attached, without the careful professional distance of Mr. Choi, or the sponsor's representative, and she watched it land on him visibly, something shifting behind his eyes at the sound of it. "Penelope," he said back. testing the same small intimacy. And it did something entirely unreasonable to her composure that she chose, firmly, to blame on the adrenaline. "I'm fine," she said again, mostly to remind herself. "I know." He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly professional. "I'll see you tomorrow." He left without further comment, walking toward the doors with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a man working very hard to look like nothing unusual had just happened, and Penelope watched him go with her pulse still refusing to return to any recognisable baseline. Sumin appeared at her side approximately 4 seconds later, coffee forgotten, eyebrows somewhere near her hairline. "So," she said, "that happened." That was an accident. That was the least accidental thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life, and I watched him give a shareholder presentation once where the projector caught fire and he didn't so much as raise his voice. Sumin studied her with new and considerable interest. "You called him Jinho. It's his name. You've called him Mr. Choi for 3 weeks. Penelope didn't answer that, mostly because she didn't have an answer that wouldn't give away considerably more than she intended to. That night, lying awake in the guest house with the window cracked to let in the sound of the city, she found she could still feel the exact pressure of his arm at her waist, the exact rhythm of his uneven breathing against her palms, the exact low register of her own name in his voice. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 1 in the morning, that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd allowed herself to admit. She thought, before sleep finally took her, that she should probably do something about that. She had absolutely no intention of doing anything about that at all. The rehearsal ran late on Thursday. Later than usual, the whole company pushing through a full run of Act 2 that kept collapsing in the same place, a transition that refused to breathe correctly no matter how many times they attacked it. By 10 o'clock, Penelope had sent everyone home except the stage manager, who was resetting marks for the morning, and herself, who remained on the floor long after there was any professional reason to. She was still there at 10:30, sitting on the edge of the stage with her shoes off and a bottle of water she'd forgotten to drink, when she became aware she wasn't alone. Jinho stood a few feet away, jacket over his arm, looking like a man who'd told himself several times on the way over that he had a reasonable excuse for coming, and had not yet managed to construct one. "Sumin left 40 minutes ago," Penelope said without turning around. "I know. So you're not here to collect her?" "No." She looked over at him then. He looked, for once, slightly at a loss. Not his usual contained stillness, but something more exposed. A man who had walked into a building without a plan and was now realising it. "I was passing," he said, "at 10:30 on a Thursday." "Yes. Past a rehearsal studio in a part of the city you have no other reason to be in. I had a dinner nearby. Did you enjoy it?" A pause. "I didn't go." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and patted the stage floor beside her. "Sit down before you have to invent a third excuse. I don't think your credibility can take it." He sat. Not close exactly, but closer than strangers. Close enough that she could smell the clean cedar note of his cologne and feel the particular quality of someone choosing to stay rather than simply passing through. "Long day," she said. "Long month." He loosened his tie, an action she suspected he did rarely enough in public that it registered as its own kind of confession. "The board wants quarterly numbers I don't have yet. My mother wants me at a dinner I've now missed twice, and somehow the thing I found myself looking forward to today was standing in a doorway watching people fall over on purpose. We call it choreography. I've noticed you're very particular about the terminology. It's the only thing standing between this production and complete chaos. I protect it fiercely." She stretched her legs out, tipping her head back to look at the grid of lights above them, dark now except for one work light left burning over centre stage. "Why choreography, out of curiosity, of all the things you could be doing with your evenings?" He considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "I don't know, precisely. I spend most of my life around decisions that are entirely rational. Numbers, contracts, forecasts. Nothing in that world requires me to feel anything about it. He glanced sideways at her. Watching your dancers, I feel something about it. I couldn't tell you what exactly, but it's the first thing in longer than I'd like to admit that hasn't felt like work. That's either the loneliest thing you've ever said to me or the most honest. Possibly both. She studied him for a moment, really studied him, the way she studied dancers when she was trying to understand what was underneath the technique. Up close, without the suit doing its usual work of authority, he looked younger than she'd assumed and more tired and considerably more human. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not a boardroom answer, something you wouldn't say in an interview." "That's a strange request. I'm a strange woman. Humour me." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then, "I took over the company at 29. My father had a stroke. There wasn't a transition plan. There was just me on a Tuesday, suddenly responsible for 40,000 people's salaries. I haven't taken a real holiday since. I don't think I know how anymore. I'm not sure I remember what I wanted before all of it happened, or whether I ever asked myself the question." He looked at her, faintly surprised at his own sentence. "I've never said that to anyone." "Not even Sumin?" "Especially not Sumin. She'd worry." "I might worry too." "You're different." He said it simply, without performance, which made it land harder than if he'd tried. "You don't look at me like I'm supposed to have already solved it." She let that sit for a moment, unwilling to disturb it with a joke, though a joke was her usual reflex when things threatened to become too true too quickly. "Your turn," he said. "Something true." "I was engaged once, 4 years ago." She hadn't planned to say it, but the dark stage and the late hour seemed to invite things that daylight discouraged. "He wanted me to choreograph smaller, safer things. West End revivals, corporate galas, steady, respectable, home by 6. I wanted the messy, difficult work, the kind that keeps you up at night because you're not sure you're getting it right." She shrugged. "We wanted very different lives wearing the same ring. I ended it. Everyone was very surprised I chose the difficult work over the safe man." "Were you surprised?" "No." She smiled slightly. "I've never once regretted it, which either makes me very brave or very selfish, depending who you ask." "I'd say neither. I'd say you knew what you needed and had the discipline to choose it, even when it cost you something. That's rarer than either of the other two." She looked at him properly then, something in his voice landing somewhere she hadn't fully braced for. "That's a generous read of a broken engagement." "I don't think I'm being generous. I think I'm agreeing with you." They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that would have felt awkward an hour into knowing someone and felt now oddly companionable, two people who had each said something true and were letting the room hold it without rushing to fill the space. "Walk with me," she said eventually, standing and reaching for her shoes. "I've been staring at these walls since 8 this morning. I'd like to see the city instead of imagining it." He didn't hesitate, which she noted. Seoul at 11 at night had a different texture than Seoul in daylight, quieter in the residential stretches, the noise of the city receding into pools of golden light from convenience stores and the occasional late bar. Its more spectacular energy folded away for the night like a stage between performances. They walked without any particular destination, the kind of aimless route that only works when neither person minds where it leads. "Tell me about London," he said. "Grey, loud, full of people who complain about the weather and would be devastated if it changed." She glanced sideways at him. "I miss it more than I expected to. And not the city, exactly. The specific quality of coming home to a place that knows you already. Does Seoul not know you yet?" "Seoul and I are still getting acquainted. We're at the stage where we're both being terribly polite." She smiled. "Ask me again in a month." "I intend to." Something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, without any of his usual careful hedging, made her look at him for a beat too long. He noticed her noticing, and for once didn't look away. "Tell me something about you that has nothing to do with the company," she said, partly to move the moment somewhere she felt less exposed in. He thought about it as they crossed an empty intersection, the light changing for no one but them. I used to play piano, badly. My mother insisted the way mothers do. I hated it until I was around 16 and realised it was the only hour of my day nobody expected anything of me. I haven't touched a piano in 11 years. Why not? No time, or that's the excuse I give myself. He paused. Watching Mrs. Yoon play for your rehearsals is the closest I've come to missing it. You should play again. Perhaps, he glanced at her. You have a talent for making perhaps feel like a commitment. I have a talent for making people do things that are good for them. It's mostly why I have a career. He laughed, an actual laugh, low and startled out of him, the kind that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, like a sound his own body had forgotten it was capable of making. She stopped walking just for a second and looked at him properly. What? He asked, noticing. Nothing, I don't think I've heard you do that before. Do what? Laugh, properly, not the version you do in board meetings to be polite. He considered this, something almost sheepish crossing his face. I don't think I have, recently, not like that. Well, she started walking again, matching her pace to his, close enough now that their arms brushed occasionally, and neither of them moved to correct it. I'll consider it a professional accomplishment. Add it to the sponsorship report. I'll make sure the board hears about it. They walked another 20 minutes before either of them acknowledged out loud that neither of them had any real reason to still be out, that the guest house was 3 streets behind them, that some tacit agreement had formed to simply keep going rather than end the evening at its logical point. When they finally stopped outside her building, the silence between them had a different weight than any silence that had come before it. Charged, unfinished, the kind of quiet that exists specifically to be broken by something neither party is quite ready to say. Thank you, she said, for the walk, and for not fully explaining why you were loitering outside my rehearsal at 10:30. I'll work on my excuses. Please don't, they're the best part. He held her gaze a moment longer than the good night required, something unresolved sitting openly between them now, visible in a way it hadn't been before tonight. Good night, Penelope. Good night, Jinho. She let herself inside before either of them could do anything about the several seconds neither of them had wanted to end, and stood just inside the door for a moment afterward, listening to her own heartbeat, thinking that whatever this was, it had stopped being nothing several streets ago. The production had a rare, free Sunday. No rehearsal, no board obligations, a single unclaimed day that neither of them quite knew what to do with, separately or, as it turned out, together. It started with a text, which was itself a small event, since neither of them had exchanged numbers under any obvious professional pretext, and both had spent an embarrassing amount of time constructing reasons to justify asking for the others. Sumin gave me your number. I hope that's all right. Penelope had stared at the message for longer than she'd admit to anyone, then typed back, Depends entirely on what you intend to do with it. I was going to suggest Bukchon. If you haven't seen it properly yet, no production business, no sponsorship pretext. Just an afternoon, he responded. She'd smiled at her phone like an idiot for a full 10 seconds before answering. He pulled up outside the guest house in a low, matte grey Aston Martin, engine idling with a sound like something being restrained. Penelope noted it the way she noted most things, quietly, without comment, filing the detail away, rather than remarking on it. She'd known men who needed the reaction. She had no interest in giving it to him. Morning, she said instead, getting in as though it were any other car. Morning. If he'd expected a response to the car, he didn't show it either, and something about the mutual non-event of it made her like him slightly more. Bukchon, in the late morning, was a tangle of narrow lanes and traditional roof lines, tourists photographing hanok doorways, the smell of roasting chestnuts drifting from a cart at the corner. He walked slightly behind her at first, watching her take it in, and she caught him at it and raised an eyebrow. There it is again. The look. I'm allowing you to look at the view before I ruin it by talking. That's generous of you, assuming you'd ruin it. I usually do. Ask anyone in my quarterly meetings. She laughed, and something in him visibly eased at the sound of it, the particular tension he carried in his shoulders loosening by some small but noticeable degree. They spent the afternoon wandering without a plan. A tea house where he ordered without looking at the menu, and she teased him mercilessly for being irregular somewhere so charming and unguarded, a bookshop with a cat asleep in the window that he seemed genuinely delighted by in a way his usual composure rarely permitted, a narrow alley where she stopped to photograph a doorway, and he stood a little apart, watching her frame the shot with the same total absorption she brought to her work. You do that with everything, he said, when she lowered the camera. Do what? Look at things like you're trying to understand what makes them work, not just what they look like. Occupational hazard. I've spent so long taking rooms apart to see how they move that I've forgotten how to simply look at something and leave it alone. I don't think that's a flaw. No? No, I think it's the reason everyone in that rehearsal room would follow you into traffic if you asked them to. She glanced at him sideways. Would you? I already have, he said. Metaphorically. I moved a supplier call for you last week. That's considerably more dangerous than traffic. By evening they'd ended up somewhere neither of them had planned. A low stone wall above the city, past the last of the tourist crowds, where the Hanok rooftops gave way to a view of Seoul lighting up in the blue hour, the city's noise reduced to a distant hum. They sat close, closer than the bench required, her shoulder near enough to his that the fabric of their sleeves occasionally brushed. Tell me something you've never told anyone, she said. It had become a kind of ritual between them, these small confessions, though neither had named it as one. He considered it, watching the lights below rather than her. I used to want to leave the company before my father's stroke. I'd applied quietly, without telling anyone, to a graduate program in urban planning. I wanted to build things, not run things, build them. He exhaled. I never told him. I never told anyone. The acceptance letter came 4 days after he collapsed. I threw it away without opening it. Do you regret that? I used to think I didn't have the luxury of regretting it. Lately, I've started to wonder if that was simply the story I needed to survive the decision. He looked at her finally. You make me think about things I'd stopped letting myself think about. Is that a compliment or an accusation? I haven't decided yet. She smiled, but something in his tone had shifted the air between them, made it feel thinner, more charged. Your turn, he said. Something true. She was quiet for a moment, turning the question over honestly instead of reaching for something safe. I'm frightened of how much I don't want to leave, she said finally. Not just the production. This. She gestured vaguely between them, unable to find a cleaner word for it. I built an entire life around not needing anyone to make it feel complete, and somewhere in the last month that stopped being quite true, and I don't know what to do with the difference. He turned to face her fully now, closing what remained of the space between them without seeming to notice he was doing it. I don't know what to do with it either. I've never wanted anything I couldn't simply plan my way toward. I don't know how to plan for this. Maybe it isn't something you plan for. That's a deeply unsettling thought, coming from a man who plans everything. Try it anyway, she said softly, just this once. The city hummed below them, distant and indifferent. He lifted a hand slowly and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. The first time he'd touched her with no accident, no adrenaline, no excuse of choreography to explain it away. His fingers lingered at her jaw, and she felt her own breath go unsteady in a way she had no interest in disguising anymore. Penelope? Yes? I think I'm supposed to say something clever right now. I can't think of a single thing. Then don't. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, could see the exact moment his composure gave way entirely to something raw, something he'd clearly spent weeks keeping carefully contained. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, and hers did the same to his, and the space between them narrowed to almost nothing. A breath, a heartbeat, the barest inch left between two people who had spent a month circling exactly this moment without ever quite naming it. Somewhere below, the night split open. Sirens first, 2, then 4, then what sounded like an entire fleet, red and blue lights sweeping up the hillside from the narrow street below the wall. A confusion of shouting followed, sharp and fast, and then the unmistakable bark of a police dog, close enough that both of them flinched apart on instinct before either had time to decide to. What on earth? Penelope was already turning toward the noise. Below them, chaos had erupted in the alley they'd wandered through, not 20 minutes earlier. Officers spilling out of 2 cruisers, flashlights cutting across the stone walls, a German shepherd straining at its lead toward a shuttered storefront, while someone shouted instructions in rapid Korean. A small crowd of nighttime stragglers had gathered at a safe distance, phones already raised. Some kind of break-in, it looks like, Jinho said, standing now, positioning himself slightly between her and the edge of the wall, with an instinct she suspected he wasn't even aware of. Stay back from the ledge. I'm hardly going to fall in, Jinho. I'm a professional dancer. Humour me. They watched, both of them still catching their breath for reasons that had nothing to do with the commotion below, as the scene resolved itself with surprising speed. A man in dark clothing emerging from a side door with his hands already raised, the dog called off, the flashing lights settling into the more orderly rhythm of an arrest being processed, rather than a chase still underway. Well, Penelope said after a moment, her voice not quite steady, that's certainly one way to ruin a view. Jinho hadn't moved from his position half a step in front of her, and didn't seem in any hurry to. When he finally looked back at her, whatever had been building between them was still there, plainly, though the moment itself had been thoroughly and irretrievably scattered by sirens and a very committed police dog. I don't suppose, she said, we could pretend that didn't happen and pick back up where we left off. I've negotiated hostile takeovers with more grace than I currently have available to me, he admitted. I don't think I can will my heart rate back down on command. She laughed, a startled, genuine sound, some of the tension breaking with it. I don't think I've ever seen you this rattled by something that had absolutely nothing to do with you. I'm discovering that's becoming something of a pattern this evening. She smiled at that, though something wistful moved behind it, the particular ache of a moment that had been so close, so entirely ready, and was now irretrievably gone. He seemed to feel the same loss, watching her with an expression that suggested he was already calculating how soon he could engineer another evening exactly like this one, minus the sirens. Come on, he said finally, offering his hand to help her up from the wall. I should get you back, before Seoul finds a third way to interrupt us. He didn't let go of her hand once she was standing, and neither of them mentioned it the entire walk back to the car, the near miss still humming quietly between them, unfinished, patiently waiting for its next chance. The email arrived on Monday, subject line unremarkable, timing catastrophic, contract extension, response required. Penelope read it twice at her desk before she fully absorbed what it was. The production company in London, the one she'd deferred for 2 months to take this job, needed an answer. A new project, a major one, the kind she'd spent a decade building toward, was ready to start pre-production, and they needed her back by the end of next month, or they'd offer the position elsewhere. 6 weeks. She sat with the number for a long time before she told anyone. Jinho found out from Sumin, which was, in retrospect, the worst possible way for him to find out. She's leaving in 6 weeks, his sister said, dropping into the chair across from his desk without invitation, the way she'd done since she was old enough to walk into his office uninvited and had never stopped. London called, some big new production. She hasn't said yes yet, but she will. He kept his eyes on the document in front of him, a quarterly report he had read the same paragraph of 4 times without absorbing a word. Why would she tell you, and not me? Because you're the sponsor's representative, Oppa, not her personal life. She's not obligated to report her contract timeline to you. Soo-min watched him carefully. I only found out because I asked her directly why she looked like someone had told her bad news at lunch. When does she leave precisely? 6 weeks, maybe less, if she has to be there for pre-production meetings. She paused. You should say something to her. Say what? I don't know, something. Anything other than what you've been doing, which is showing up to rehearsal 3 times a week and hoping the situation resolves itself through sheer proximity. He set down his pen with more force than necessary. There's nothing to resolve. She has a career in London. I have a company here. Those are simply facts. Those are facts you've decided are more important than the other fact, which is that you've been happier in the last month than I've seen you in years, and you're about to let her get on a plane without telling her that? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're just choosing to make it complicated because complicated feels safer than saying something true and being told no. Soo-min stood, gathering her bag. You told her about Dad, about the piano. I know because she told me, not the details, just that you'd opened up to her in a way she said surprised her. Don't tell me that man doesn't exist anymore just because there's a deadline now. She left him alone with the quarterly report, which he did not read another word of that day. He made 3 irrational decisions over the following week, each of which he justified to himself with the same brittle logic he'd have dismantled instantly in anyone else's boardroom proposal. The first was moving a board meeting, an actual board meeting with actual shareholders flying in from Tokyo, by 2 hours, so that he could attend the full run of Act 2 instead of catching the last 20 minutes. He told his assistant it was a scheduling necessity. Ms. Park did not ask questions, though her expression suggested she had several. The second was commissioning, quietly, through a contact he'd used exactly once before for a corporate gala, a search for available international choreographers who might be willing to consult on the production remotely, a solution to a problem no one had asked him to solve, designed entirely to create a reason Penelope's expertise might still be needed after her contract ended. He deleted the email to the contact twice before sending it, aware of exactly how transparent the gesture was and unable, in the moment, to care. The third was standing outside her rehearsal room for 11 minutes on a Wednesday evening, working up the sentence he intended to say, and then saying none of it, because Soo-min was right there fussing over a costume fitting and the moment did not feel like it belonged to anyone but the two of them, and he refused to spend it badly. Penelope, for her part, was doing an admirable job of not thinking about any of it, which meant she thought about almost nothing else. She hadn't responded to London. She told herself it was because she was busy, which was true, and because the timeline was inconvenient, which was also true, and studiously avoided examining the third reason, which involved a man who had started finding excuses to attend rehearsal with a frequency that had stopped being subtle roughly 2 weeks ago, and had, if anything, only continued to escalate. You haven't said yes, Soo-min observed one afternoon, watching her review notes with unusual distraction. I haven't said no, either. That's not really an answer. It's the only one I have at the moment. Penelope closed her notebook. It's a good job, Soo-min, the kind I've spent 10 years working toward. I'd be foolish to turn it down for... She stopped herself. For what? For nothing. I didn't finish that sentence for a reason. You finished it in your head, though. I can tell. Soo-min softened, dropping the teasing for something more direct. For what it's worth, and I recognise I'm not exactly neutral here, I don't think my brother would ask you to stay. He's not built that way. He'd think it was unfair to ask, even if it's killing him not to. Then perhaps it's fortunate no one's asking. Perhaps. Soo-min studied her for a long moment. But you'd tell me if you wanted someone to, wouldn't you? Ask? Penelope didn't answer that. She picked her notebook back up and returned to her notes with a focus that was almost entirely performance, and Soo-min, wise enough not to push further, let her have it. It came to a head on a Friday in the emptied-out theatre after everyone else had gone, the way most of the important moments between them seemed to. Jinho was there under no pretense at all this time. No meeting, no coffee run, no sister to collect. He simply stood in the doorway until Penelope noticed him, and crossed the floor when she waved him over, and sat beside her on the edge of the stage the way he had weeks earlier, except the silence between them now had an entirely different quality. "Sumin told me," he said finally, "about London. I assumed she would. 6 weeks. Give or take." He looked at his hands, turning something over that he didn't say for a long moment. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know." It was the most honest answer she had, and she watched it cost him something to hear it. "It's everything I've worked for. The kind of production that doesn't come around twice." "Then you should take it." "Should I?" "I would never ask you not to." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight in a way she'd learned to read over the past weeks, a tell for exactly how much control the steadiness was costing him. "You deserve the career you've built. I won't be the reason you doubt that." "That's very generous of you." "It's not generous, it's just true." He finally looked at her. "It doesn't mean I want you to go." The admission sat between them, plain and unadorned, the first time either of them had said anything so direct. "Then say what you actually want to say," she said quietly, "instead of what you think is fair." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she'd come to understand meant he was working up to something that cost him more than his usual careful composure allowed. "I don't have the right to ask you to stay," he said finally. "I know that. You have a life, a career, a whole world that exists outside 6 weeks in Seoul. But I find that I've stopped being able to imagine my evenings without figuring out some reason to be wherever you are, and I don't know what to do with that, because I've never once in my life let myself want something this much that I couldn't simply acquire through effort or money or persistence. This isn't a negotiation I know how to win." "Maybe it isn't a negotiation at all. Then I have even less idea what to do with it." She reached over, without entirely deciding to, and took his hand. The first time either of them had done something so simple and so entirely without ambiguity. He looked down at their hands, then back at her. Something in his expression finally, fully unguarded. "I don't have an answer for you," she said. "Not tonight, but I haven't said yes to London either. And I think that tells you something, even if I'm not ready to say it out loud yet." "I can wait," he said. "I'm not good at very much outside a boardroom, but I'm very good at waiting for the right outcome." 6 weeks isn't very long to wait. "It's considerably longer," he said quietly, "than I expect it to feel." 3 days before opening, the theatre emptied out by 10, and Penelope stayed anyway. She'd sent the company home an hour earlier. Final dress had run clean, no notes worth losing sleep over, everyone needing rest more than further polish. But she lingered on the stage after the last of them filtered out, walking the marks alone under the ghost light, running the final sequence in her head one more time the way she always did the week before opening, when the piece stopped being hers to fix and started belonging to whoever watched it. Then she heard Jinho come in. She turned to find him in the house, several rows back, jacket already off, watching her with the stillness she'd come to recognise as his version of full attention. He said nothing. Neither did she for a moment, the two of them simply looking at each other across the dark expanse of empty seats, the theatre holding its breath around them. Something in the stillness of the place, the late hour, loosened something in her she usually kept carefully fastened. She crossed to the small speaker the stage manager used for warm-ups, and put on a low, aching piece of music that belonged to no one and nothing except this particular midnight. She didn't ask if he minded. She simply pressed play, set the phone down, and let the sound fill the empty house. Then she began to move. She let her body answer the music the way it always did when no one was meant to be watching. Loose, unguarded, entirely her own, drifting across the mark she knew better than her own hands, arms tracing shapes that belonged to no vocabulary, but the one she'd built for herself over a lifetime of empty rooms just like this one. She was aware of him the entire time. The thing that made it dangerous rather than simply private. She knew exactly where he sat, knew he hadn't looked away, knew that every turn she took was in some small and entirely deliberate way being offered rather than merely performed. She let her eyes find him once, briefly, across the distance of the house and did not look away first. He rose from his seat. He didn't say anything as he slowly made his way down the aisle, didn't call out or ask permission, and she didn't stop moving as he approached, only let the shape of her dancing bend, almost imperceptibly, around the fact of him. A widening pull toward the stage's edge where he now stood, hands loose at his sides, watching her the way he'd watched her that very first night, except there was nothing left now of the careful distance that had defined that memory. He climbed the steps slowly, the ghost light throwing long shadows across the stage floor, and stopped an arm's length from her, closer than any professional distance would allow, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the space still separating them. She circled him once, unhurried, her fingers trailing lightly along his arm as she passed, feeling him go still under the touch. She came to a stop in front of him as the music slowed, close enough now that neither of them was pretending distance mattered anymore, her hand coming to rest flat against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat going as unsteady as her own. "You've been watching me all night," she said softly. "I've been watching you for 11 weeks. "I know." She tilted her face up toward his, and he lifted a hand to trace the line of her jaw the way he had once before, on a wall above the city. In a moment the world had interrupted before either of them was ready to let it end. "I rather like being watched by you. I've never liked it from anyone else." "I don't know how to stop." "Then don't." His hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, and for a long suspended moment neither of them moved at all. Simply stood there in the hush of the empty theatre, foreheads a breath apart, the music fading out around them into silence, both of them fully aware, without a single word left to hide behind, that this time there would be no siren, no phone call, no convenient interruption to save them from what they'd been circling for 11 weeks. So he closed the distance himself. The kiss was slow, almost careful at first. The particular carefulness of two people who had spent 11 weeks imagining this exact moment and were reluctant to rush past it now that it had finally arrived. Her hand curled into the front of his shirt, the same instinct from the night of the fall, except this time there was nothing accidental in the way she pulled him closer. His arm wrapped fully around her waist, steady, certain, holding her the way he'd caught her once before, except now there was nothing to catch her from except her own willingness to let go. She felt him exhale against her mouth, some long-held breath finally released, and the careful restraint that had defined every interaction between them for weeks gave way to something deeper, more unguarded. His hand tightening at the back of her neck, her fingers sliding up to the collar of his shirt, both of them entirely unwilling for once to be the one who pulled back first. When they finally broke apart, it was only far enough to breathe, foreheads still resting together, her hands still fisted lightly in his shirt. "Well?" she said, a little unsteadily, a little breathlessly. "That took an inconvenient amount of time." 11 weeks, he murmured. "I was counting." "You were not." "I absolutely was." He drew back just enough to look at her properly, something in his expression finally, entirely undone. None of the composure left, none of the careful distance, just a man looking at the one thing he'd stopped being able to plan his way around. "I've never wanted anything the way I want this. I don't think I know what to do with that." "I'd suggest," she said softly, tugging him back down toward her, "starting with exactly what you were just doing." He laughed against her mouth, low, surprised, entirely undignified for a man who ran a company of 40,000 people, and kissed her again, slower this time, no urgency left to rush it, only the quiet certainty of two people who had finally stopped pretending they weren't already, hopelessly, each other's. 3 hours before curtain, the lighting board crashed. Not flickered, not glitched, crashed entirely, the entire cue stack for Act 1 gone in a single cascading failure that left half the rig unresponsive, and the production's technical director white-faced in the wings, phone already pressed to his ear. Penelope arrived at the theatre to find chaos dressed up as a controlled emergency. The kind she'd seen before, more times than she cared to count, but never on opening night, never with this much riding on it. "How bad?" she said, dropping her bag without breaking stride toward the booth. "Bad." The technical director didn't look up from the board. "We lost the whole file, backups from 3 revisions ago, doesn't have any of the changes from this week. If we run tonight on what we've got, half your cues are just gone." "Then we rebuild it, now." "In 3 hours?" "In 3 hours." She was already pulling up a chair beside him, sleeves shoved back, mind already moving through the show cue by cue with the same focus she brought to a rehearsal room. "Call every cue back from memory if you have to. I know this show. I built this show. We are not opening with half the lighting missing." Word of the crisis moved through the building fast, the way bad news always does backstage, and within 20 minutes it had reached the one person who no longer needed an excuse to appear in the wings. Jinho, in a full suit, 3 hours before a fundraising dinner he was contractually obligated to attend, already shrugging off his jacket before he'd finished crossing the stage. "I heard," he said. "What do you need?" "You have a dinner." "I have a phone and 40 minutes I can spare before anyone notices I'm gone." He rolled up his sleeves, entirely unwilling to be moved from the booth. "Tell me what to do. I'm not asking permission this time." She didn't waste time arguing with him. Not anymore, not after 3 days of no longer pretending there was a version of them that made sense to argue against. Within 10 minutes he'd gotten the equipment manufacturer's emergency support line on speakerphone, a favour called in through channels that clearly involved a considerable amount of his company's annual spending, while the technical director worked with an engineer talking him through a manual rebuild of the missing cues. They fought the board for 2.5 hours. Penelope called cues from memory faster than she'd known she could, reconstructing lighting states scene by scene, occasionally clashing with the technical director over details. Neither of them had the luxury of debating gently. Jinho stayed the entire time, fielding calls, running for coffee no one had asked for, catching her eye across the booth every so often, in a way that had nothing to do with the crisis and everything to do with the fact that he no longer had to hide that he was watching her. At 6:40, with 20 minutes to curtain, the board came back fully alive, every cue restored. The booth went silent for 1 full second before the technical director let out a breath so relieved it was almost a laugh. Penelope sat back in her chair, hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash, and found Jinho already looking at her. That same undone expression from the theatre 3 nights ago written plainly across his face, no longer something he bothered disguising as simple admiration. "You did that," he said. "We did that." "I made phone calls. You rebuilt an entire lighting design from memory under pressure that would have broken most people." He crossed the booth to her, close enough now that the technical director discreetly found something urgent to check on the other side of the room. "I've sat in rooms with the best crisis managers money can buy. I've never seen anyone work like that." "I didn't have time to be impressive. I only had time to fix it." "That's usually when people are the most impressive," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, an unhurried gesture that had lost none of its charge in the days since she'd first let him make it without an excuse. "When they don't have room left to perform it." "You should go," she said, though she made no effort to move away from his hand. "Your dinner is already half over, and I don't care." He pressed a brief kiss to her temple, quick and certain, the kind of small claim neither of them would have allowed themselves a week ago. "I'm watching this show open. Tonight of all nights, I'm not missing it for a room full of investors." The performance itself went better than anyone in that booth had any right to expect. Penelope watched from the wings, unable to sit still, tracking every cue as it landed clean and precise, the piece she'd rebuilt from nothing 11 weeks ago, now moving with the exact trust and tension she'd spent months coaxing into it. Jinho and Aryam danced the central pas de deux with a rawness that silenced the entire house. The suspended fall, executed perfectly this time, drawing an audible intake of breath from 300 people who had no idea how close that particular sequence had once come to disaster in an entirely different way. Jinho stood beside her for most of it, having quietly abandoned any pretense of returning to his dinner, his hand finding hers in the dark of the wings during the second act and not letting go again. When the lights finally came up for curtain call, the ovation that followed was not polite. It was full-throated, sustained, the kind of response that told her everything she needed to know about whether the sleepless weeks had been worth it. "Well?" she asked afterward, breathless, still riding the adrenaline of the ovation, turning to find him watching her with the same unguarded intensity that had undone her 3 nights ago on this very stage. "I don't have adequate words for what I just watched." "That's unlike you. You always have words." "Not for this." He drew her toward him, out of the worst of the backstage traffic, the noise of the celebrating cast and crew fading into background static around them. "I've spent my entire life believing that value is measurable. Revenue, growth, quarterly performance. Tonight I watched 300 people stand up and weep over something you built out of almost nothing in a matter of weeks, and I don't have a spreadsheet that accounts for what that's worth." "It's just theatre, Jinho." "It's not just anything," he said. "It's the first time in 11 years I've watched something and forgotten entirely that I was supposed to be thinking about anything else." He paused, something more serious settling behind his eyes. "And it's the last time I'm going to pretend I don't know exactly how little time we have left before you're supposed to get on a plane." The reminder landed between them quietly, opening night's euphoria not quite enough to fully cover the 6 weeks, now closer to 2, that neither of them had found a way to solve. "Not tonight," she said softly, echoing words she'd said to him once before, in an empty theatre, at the edge of something neither of them had been ready to name. "Tonight, let's just let this be what it is. And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she said, resting her forehead briefly against his shoulder, letting herself, for one more night, not have an answer. "We'll figure out how to be brave about the rest of it." Around them, the cast was already celebrating, champagne appearing from somewhere, Sumin shrieking with delight over the reviews already circulating on someone's phone, an entire company drunk on the specific joy of having built something and watched it land. Jinho pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, unhurried, entirely unbothered by who might see. And for one suspended moment, neither of them thought once about London or contracts, or the clock that had already started counting down the last of their borrowed time,